He was the most feared man in New York, and only a waitress could save him. Serafina's courage forced Enzo to see the people his world ignored. This story reminds us that power without humanity becomes a prison. Like this video, comment below, share it, and subscribe for the next chapter.
Dinner rush was over by 10. That was the lie the schedule told anyway. At Castelvetro, the rush was never really over. The rich didn't eat dinner. They held court. They stayed. Nina Conti moved between the tables like she'd been doing it her whole life, which more or less she had. 3 years here. 6 years before that, 2 other places. She knew the dance. Refill the water before they ask. Clear the plate before they notice it's empty. Smile, but not too much. Be there, but not there. Be invisible. That was the job. Nobody put it on the application, but everybody knew. She balanced 4 plates up one arm. Nonna Rosalia waited tables at a diner in Queens with a bad knee and a worse boss. You carry the plates, Nonna used to say, but you don't carry shame. The work is honest. Honest work has dignity. Whoever forgets that they are the ones who should be embarrassed, not you. Sarah was 14 the first time she heard it. She didn't get it then. She got it now. Table 6 wanted the wine list again. Table 9 wanted to know if the Branzino was fresh or just fresh. Table 11 snapped his fingers at her. Actually snapped. Like she was a dog. She didn't flinch. She walked over. She smiled. Yes, sir. More bread. No, please. No look up from his phone. Just the words and the finger. She brought the bread. She set it down soft to the basket. Didn't make a sound. In her head, very quietly, she said the thing Nonna taught her to say. You don't see me. That's your loss, not mine. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was something steadier than pride. It was the difference between feeling small and being treated small. One you can't control. The other you can. Door swung. Heat and noise. Marco, the line cook, handed her a plate and a wink. Big table tonight, he said. It's private room. Don't go in there unless they ring. Why? Because. He lowered his voice. Castellano. Sarah knew the name. Everybody in the neighborhood knew the name. You didn't say it loud. You said it the way Marco said it. Sideways, half a breath. The Castellano family didn't come up in conversation. They came up in silences. In the way her old landlord went quiet when a certain car parked outside. In the way men changed the subject. She'd never seen one of them. Until 11:40. The private room rang. Mr. Vito, the manager, was busy with the credit card machine and the other server had clocked out, and so it was her. Of course it was her. She smoothed her apron. She pushed the door. The room was beautiful and cold. Dark wood. Low light. Men around a long table, and at the head of it, one who didn't need to be told he was at the head of it. Enzo Castellano. He was younger than she'd pictured. Or no, not younger. Tireder. That was the word. A man who carried something heavy and had stopped noticing the weight. His suit was perfect. His eyes were somewhere else. He didn't look at her when she came in. None of them did. Good, that was the job. She's refilled water. She cleared a plate. She moved like smoke. And that's when she heard it. 2 men at the far end. Heads close. Talking low, not in English, not even in the smooth Italian the others used. In Sicilian, her grandmother's tongue, the language of long afternoons in a hot kitchen in Queens, the language Nonna refused to let die. They tried to make us forget where we came from, she used to say. So we remember louder. Sarah's hands kept moving. Plate, glass, plate. But her ears went still. Most people in that room, most people in this whole city would have heard noise. Background. A dead old dialect nobody spoke anymore. She heard words. She heard Tuesday. She heard the docks. The man say, soft as a prayer, when he signs we move. He doesn't leave this building. And the other one laughed. The laugh of a man who already knew how the night ended. Sarah did not stop pouring the water. That was the thing she'd be proud of later, when she had time to be proud of anything. Her hand did not shake. The glass did not clink. Her face stayed exactly where it was pleasant, blank, gone. 3 years of being invisible. Turned out invisible was a kind of armor. She set the pitcher down. She backed toward the door, slow, the way you back away from something that hasn't seen you yet. Her heart was a fist against her ribs. Walk away, a voice said inside her. You're a waitress, not a cop, not a hero. Whatever war these men are having, it's not yours. And it would have been so easy. Push the door, clock out. And home to Matteo, who'd be up too late again, waiting, because he always waited. Nobody would ever know what she heard. She'd know. And there was the other voice. The older one. The one with a slight rasp and a kitchen behind it. We don't turn away from people in danger, Serafina. That's not who we are. The whole world stayed quiet once, and look what it cost us. You hear something, you do something, even when you're scared. Especially then. Sarah stood with her hand on the door. She looked back at the man at the head of the table. The tired one, the dangerous one, who had no idea he was already a dead man with a pen in his hand. He still hadn't seen her. Nobody ever did. She let go of the door. And she picked up the wine. She crossed the room with the wine. 12 steps. She counted them. Counting kept her hands honest. The bottle was a Nero d'Avola Sicilian half full. Funny that. The wine and the warning came from the same island. Enzo Castellano didn't look up. In his hand and a stack of papers in front of him, attention was the kind that filled a room and left no space for anyone else. A man like that doesn't see the help. The help is furniture. The help is air. She leaned in to pour. Close. Closer than a server should. Close enough that her mouth was near his ear, and her voice would go nowhere but to him. Normal thing. The most normal thing in the world. And under her breath in Sicilian she said it. It's a trap. Don't sign anything. I'm going to kill you tonight. The pen stopped. That was all. The pen just stopped. A small thing. You'd miss it if you weren't watching. But she was watching. And she saw the stillness move through him like a stone dropped in water. He didn't turn. Smart. He didn't look at her. Smarter, say that again, he murmured. Sicilian. The real thing. The Palermo sound, rough at the edges, exactly like Nana's. The two at the end of the table. She topped off his glass like it mattered. They're not your friends. The docks. Move your operation. They detonate. They take the territory while you're dealing with the mess. You don't leave this building if you sign. She straightened. She capped the bottle. She stepped back, eyes down, the picture of a girl who'd done nothing but pour a man some wine. Her whole body was screaming. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. 3 seconds is a long time. You can count a lot in 3 seconds. You can wonder if you just signed your own death warrant. And think about your little brother at home, up too late, waiting. Then Enzo Castellano set it down. He set it down soft, deliberate, like a man laying down a weapon or picking one up. Gentlemen, he said. English now. And his voice had changed. The tired was gone. Something cold had walked in to take its place. I've changed my mind. We're not signing tonight. The table shifted. You could feel it. Mr. Castellano, who'd led the talking smooth silver hair, an accent she couldn't place, spread his hands. We've worked months on this. Everything is in order. Then it'll still be in order next week. Enzo leaned back. I want my people to audit your operation. Top to bottom. Call it a feeling. Moved. Just barely. To the two at the end. And Sarah watched the exact second those two men understood that something had gone wrong. Inside his jacket, Tommy, Enzo said. Quiet. Almost bored. Big man by the door moved like water poured downhill. Smooth, no wasted motion. He had the reaching man's arm twisted up behind his back and his face down on the table before the gun ever cleared the cloth. Then everything happened at once. A chair went over. Somebody shouted in a language that wasn't Sicilian and wasn't English. 2 more of Enzo's men came out of corners Sarah hadn't even clocked as corners. She pressed herself flat against the wall, the wine bottle still in her hand, useless, and watched a business dinner turn into something else entirely. 90 seconds, maybe less. When it was over, all 5 of the guests were on their knees with their hands zip-tied behind them. Tommy laid their weapons out on the white tablecloth, like a waiter presenting the specials. 4 guns, 2 knives, and a phone with wires taped to it that made Sarah's stomach drop because she knew what that was without anyone telling her. Enzo stood. He crossed the room toward her. He was taller than he'd looked sitting down. Everyone is, but with him it felt like the room got smaller. What's your name? Sicilian again. The Palermo sound. Serafina. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Conti, you speak Sicilian. My grandmother. She was from a village outside Palermo. He studied her. Not the way the men at table 11 studied her. Not up and down. He looked at her face. Like there was a person attached to it. You understood what they said. All of it. The docks. The timing. The cartel taking over after. She swallowed. Except they're not a cartel. Not those two. Something flickered in his eyes. Explain. They're Sicilian. She shook her head ahead hunting for it. It's wrong. The accents. It's not Palermo, it's not Catania, it's inland. Old. The kind nobody speaks anymore unless their whole family speaks it. She paused. My grandmother used to make me listen to recordings. To keep it alive. That sound. I've heard that sound. Enzo went very still. He reached down and lifted one of the men's hands by the zip tie. Turned it. On the 3rd finger, a heavy gold ring. A crest stamped into it, a tower, a serpent, a cluster of grapes. He looked at it for a long time. Tommy, he said. He didn't take his eyes off the ring. Come here. Tommy came. looked. His jaw tightened. "That's not possible," Tommy said quietly. "And yet, what is it?" Sarah asked. Before she could remember, she was supposed to be invisible. Enzo set the man's hand down, gentle, the way you'd put down something you didn't trust yourself to hold. "Aiello," he said. "It's the Aiello crest." A breath. "My father shook hands with their father 20 years ago. In front of God and both families, they swore the war was over. I was there. I was 16. I watched them light a candle." He looked at the man on his knees. The man spat blood on the floor and smiled up at him, and when he spoke, it was in that old inland Sicilian, slow and almost loving. "The candle went out a long time ago, Castellano." Enzo didn't answer him. Turned to Tommy instead and switched to English, and his voice was flat as a closed door. "Call Marco. New warehouse. The docks. Something there. I want it found and dead within the hour." On it, Tommy already had his phone out. "And the police. I'll make the call." Tommy nodded at the men on the floor. "Weapons, a detonator, conspiracy. That'll hold them while we have a longer conversation." "Good." Enzo turned back to Sarah. And here's the thing she'd think about later. On the train that never came. In the apartment she'd never sleep in that night. He didn't say thank you. He said, "Why?" Just the one word. Not even a question, really. The door he was holding open to see if she'd walk through. Why what? You could have poured the wine and walked out. His eyes didn't leave her. Most people would have. Most people are very good at not hearing things. It's a skill. It keeps them alive. You had it 3 years of it, I'd guess, the way you move. A pause, so why didn't you use it? Sarah thought about lying. Something noble that would make her sound brave instead of foolish. But there was something about the way he was looking at her. Like a real answer was the only kind he'd respect. My grandmother had a saying. She turned the small gold earrings she always wore. Nana's earrings. A nervous habit she'd never broken. She said we don't turn away from people in danger. That the world stayed quiet once when our family needed it not to. And it cost us everything. She lifted her chin. She said being scared isn't a reason. It's just the weather. You do the right thing in the rain too. For a moment, Enzo Castellano said nothing. Then he did something she didn't expect. He looked for just a second like the tired man she'd seen when she first walked in. The one carrying something heavy. The one who'd forgotten it was there. "She sounds like she was a better person than anyone in this room," he said. "She was a waitress," Sarah said. "Like me." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. He came back from the hall, phone still in his hand, and his face had gone gray. "Boss, Marco found them. 3 devices at the new warehouse. Bomb squad's got it now." He hesitated. "Enough there to take the building, and half the block with it." The room went quiet. Enzo's jaw worked once, the only crack in him. He'd been an hour, maybe 2, from being a story people told sideways, in silences the way they told all the Castellano stories. His eyes came back to Sarah, and in them now was something that hadn't been there before. Not just gratitude. "Trouble. Clear the room," he told Tommy. Everyone but Miss Conti. The men filed out. The door clicked shut. And the beautiful cold room felt very, very small. He told her to sit. She didn't. "I have a brother," she said instead. "At home. He'll be waiting up. He worries." She didn't know why that was the first thing out of her mouth. Maybe because it was the truest thing she had. To know there was a whole life attached to her. A person with people. Not just a witness. Not just a problem he'd have to solve. Enzo took the seat at the table himself. Not across from where she stood. Beside it. Like he was trying to make himself smaller too, and not quite managing. "How old is he?" 19, she stayed standing. "He has cerebral palsy. It's just us. Our grandmother raised us. She's gone now. And your parents. Also gone. Long time." He nodded slowly, like that was an answer he understood from the inside. "Sit, please," he said again. "Not because I'm telling you to. And on your feet. Since 5 o'clock. And what I have to say is going to take your legs out from under you anyway. You might as well already be sitting." She sat. "The men we took tonight," he said. "By morning, they'll have talked to the people who sent them. That's how it works. They reported in before the police ever touched them. Your name, your face from the restaurant's employee file, everything." The cold came back into her veins, and she'd first heard the word docs. What does that mean? It means the Aiellos know who you are, and the Aiellos don't forgive a witness, especially one who cost them a foothold they planned 20 years for. "I'm a waitress." Her voice cracked on it. "I don't know anything about them. I can't hurt them." "You already did." He said it without cruelty, almost gently. And in their world, that's the same thing. She gripped the edge of the table. She thought about Matteo, his laugh, the way he saved the comics page for her every Sunday because he knew she liked the dumb ones, the way he'd be sitting up right now, watching the door. "Then I'll run," she said. "I'll take Matteo and we'll go. Tonight." "Where?" The question was quiet, but it had a floor under it that dropped away. Because she didn't have an answer. There was no one. Nana had been the only family. The friends she had were shift friends, coffee friends, people she'd kept at arm's length her whole life because keeping people close had only ever cost her. "I'll figure it out," she said. "You won't have time to figure it out." He stood, walked to a sideboard, and brought her one which undid her a little, that he'd carry water to her. After a whole career of carrying it for men like him, "I can protect you. I have places. And keep you and your brother alive while I make this go away. And what does it cost?" He stopped. "What? Nothing's free." She wrapped both hands around the glass. "Not in your world. Probably not in any world. So tell me the price. Up front. I'd rather know." He looked at her for a long moment, and he set down his own glass and reached into his coat and laid a folder on the table. She opened it. A passport, her photo, a different name, Anna Bruno. Plane tickets to Rome. A bank card with a number clipped to it that had more zeros than she'd ever seen attached to her own life. "You made this," she said. "Tonight, I have people who do these things fast." He nodded at it. "That's the other option. New name, new country. Enough money to start over. Your brother gets care that's better than anything he's getting now. The ILOs never look for a dead woman in Italy. For one heartbeat, she wanted it. God, she wanted it. The clean break. The country her grandmother left, the endless tired finally over. Then something in her hardened and she pushed the folder back across the table. No, his eyebrows lifted. The word, and then she found more of them. "I'm not running from my own life because some men I never met are angry I opened my mouth. I've worked for everything I have. It isn't much. The apartment's small and the heat's bad and I count quarters at the end of the month. But it's mine. I built it. Me. Nobody handed it to me, and I'm not handing it back because it got inconvenient for somebody powerful. You understand they will try to kill you. I understand you said you could protect me." She met his eyes. "So protect me. Here, I'm not leaving." He sat back down, and this time something crossed his face that she'd swear was respect. "You're either very brave," he said, "or very foolish. My grandmother would say I got her stubborn streak. I'm starting to think your grandmother raised someone dangerous." She almost laughed. It came out shaky, but she wasn't done. Because here was the part that mattered. The part she'd promised herself in the half-second before she said no. "I have conditions." He blinked. "You have conditions. Not the only one who gets to set the price." She put her hand flat on the folder. "First, Matteo comes. Wherever you put me, he's there. He's not a complication you store somewhere convenient. He's my family. That's not negotiable. Done. Second, I'm not a prisoner. You protect me, fine. But I'm not a thing you've locked in an icebox. I want to know what's happening. I want to be told the truth. The day you start managing me like a problem instead of talking to me like a person, I walk and I take my chances." He was quiet a moment. "That one's harder," he said honestly. "My world doesn't run on truth. It runs on need to know." "Then make me need to know." She didn't blink. "You said it yourself. I heard a thing nobody else in that room could hear. I'm not useless to you. So don't treat me like a damsel you're storing in a tower. Treat me like the person who saved your life. Because that's who I am." And halfway through, and was standing by the door pretending not to listen. Almost a cough, and definitely a laugh. Enzo shot him a look, and he turned back to her, and for the first time all night, the tired left his face entirely. "You know," he said, "people don't talk to me like this. Maybe that's been your problem." The silence after that could have gone a lot of ways. He chose to let it be a small, surprised quiet. "And here's a true thing they weren't braced for. Anybody ever tell you," he said slowly, "that the way you treat people who can't help you is the only honest measure of who you are? My grandmother, word for word, she was right." He stood, held out his hand not to shake, she realized, but to help her up from the chair, the small courtesy you'd offer an equal. "Get your brother. We'll send people. Good ones. They'll knock, they won't break the door, and they'll call him sir, because that's how I'll tell them to do it." She looked at the hand. She thought about Nana in a hot kitchen in Queens, saying, "The work is honest, the work has dignity, and so do you." She took it. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Mr. Castellano." "Enzo. Okay, Enzo." She stood, her legs held, which surprised her. "But I'm still not leaving New York." Almost smiled again, and this time it nearly made it all the way. "God help me, I think I'm glad." The house was in Greenwich, and it was too big. That was Sarah's first thought when the car came up the long drive. Not beautiful, though it was. Not safe, though that was the point. Just too big. A house built for a family that wasn't there. Glass and a lawn you could lose a childhood in. Matteo pressed his face to the window. Sarah, is that a real fireplace? Are those real deer?" "I think those are real deer, bud. This is the best safe house in the history of safe houses." She laughed, even though her chest was tight. That was Matteo. He could find the wonder in a hostage situation. 19 years old and the kindest person she'd ever met. and the world had decided, before he could even walk right, to make everything harder for him. He never once acted like it owed him an apology. The men who'd come for them had been exactly what Enzo promised. They knocked. They waited. Big One Dom had crouched down to Matteo's eye level in the doorway of their apartment and said, "You're in charge of the radio, sir. Driver's choice is a tyranny and I won't stand for it." Matteo had loved him on sight. Now Dom carried their 2 duffel bags up the steps like they were luggage at a hotel and not everything 2 people owned. Enzo was waiting in the kitchen. Jeans, a gray sweater. Changed him, somehow made him look less like a story people told sideways and more like a man who got cold like everyone else. "Matteo," he said and held out his hand. Not down, straight out, the way you greet a man. Matteo shook it, delighted. "You're the Mafia boss." Matteo, what? That's what Dom said. "Dom talks too much," Enzo said, but there was something warm under it. "I'm Enzo, you hungry? More food in this kitchen than 2 grown men know what to do with, and I'm told you have opinions about pizza. Strong opinions. Then we'll get along." Sarah watched the whole thing from the doorway, and something in her shifted. She'd braced for a man who'd tolerate her brother. Store him. Be polite about him. She hadn't braced for a man who'd talk to him really talk, eye to eye, like Matteo was the most natural person in the room to talk to. It mattered more than she could say. She filed it away. The first few days were strange and quiet. Enzo was gone, most of them, into the city, into meetings she wasn't told about, which she let slide, because some need to know was fair. She explored the house. She read from a library that surprised her: poetry, history, a beat-up copy of a Sicilian cookbook, with notes in the margins in a woman's hand. His mother's, maybe. She didn't ask. She got to know the men. That was the thing she did that nobody told her to do. There were always 2 or 3 of them around, watching the road, watching the gate, watching her, in a polite way that pretended it wasn't watching. And the easy thing, the thing the world trained you to do with people like that, was to treat them like furniture, like the help, like air. She knew exactly how that felt, so she didn't do it. "What's your name?" she asked the young one by the back door the 3rd morning. He looked startled, like he'd been spoken to by a painting. Sal, ma'am." "Sal what?" "Salvatore." "Greco, you from here, Sal? Greco?" "Bensonhurst. My nonna's from Siaca, though. Sicily. Mine too. Outside Palermo." 1 cup of coffee and put it in his hand before he could say no. "How do you take it?" He stared at the cup like it might be a trick. "Black's fine." "Ma'am, you don't have to. I know I don't have to." "That's sort of the point." She leaned on the counter. "My grandmother used to say, you can tell everything about a person by how they treat the people who can't do anything for them. Waiters, doormen, the guy who guards the back of a house in the cold." She smiled. "She'd have made you breakfast and asked about your mother. So, how's your mother, Sal?" His face did something complicated. Then it softened all at once, like a fist letting go. "She's good. Bad hip. She'd like you." By the end of the week, she knew all of them. Dom, whose daughter was learning the violin badly and beautifully. Sal, whose mother had the bad hip. Marco, who didn't talk but left the heat on in whatever room she was reading in. Their names, and she used their names, and a house that had felt like a fortress started to feel, in small corners, like a place where people lived. Enzo noticed, in the doorway one evening, watching her laugh with Dom about the violin. He had a look on his face she couldn't read. "You do that on purpose," he said later, when they were alone. "Do what?" "Learn their names. Ask about their families." He said it carefully, like he was handling something he didn't fully understand. "Have worked for me for years. I'm not sure I know Dom's daughter plays violin." "Now you do. Why does it matter to you?" She thought about how to say it, settled on the truth, because that was their deal. "Because in your world they're tools," she said. "Useful as long as they work. And in my world, the waitress world, the invisible people world, we're tools too. Useful as long as we're carrying the plates." She looked at him. "I spent 3 years being heir to people like the ones at that table. I swore I'd never do it to someone else. Naming somebody is the cheapest, easiest way to say I see that you're a person. It costs nothing. And it's worth everything if you've ever been the one nobody named." Enzo was quiet a long time. "My father," he finally said, "ran this family on fear. He used to say loyalty you have to earn is weaker than loyalty you can frighten out of someone." A pause. He died sure of that. Alone, mostly, surrounded by men who feared him, and not one who'd have crossed the street to help him if there was nothing in it. "That's a sad way to be powerful," Sarah said. "Yeah." He looked at his hands. "It is." His sister showed up on a Thursday with no warning and a Boston University sweatshirt. "You didn't call," Enzo said, but he was hugging her when he said it. "You'd have told me not to come." "I'd have told you not to come." Exactly. She spotted Sarah in the kitchen doorway, and her whole face lit up. "Oh. You have a guest, a real one." Enzo doesn't have guests. She crossed the room with her hand out. Normal one in the family. And you are. Sarah, I'm staying for a while. She's working with me, Enzo said in the flat tone Sarah was learning meant don't. Bianca looked at her brother. Looked at Sarah. Looked at the 2 coffee cups on the counter and the cookbook open on the stand and the general, unmistakable evidence of a house where someone actually lived. Sure she is, Bianca said sweetly. Is there dinner? I drove 2 hours and I'm running on gas station pretzels. Dinner was loud and good. Bianca taught middle school and told stories about it like war reporting. Matteo adored her instantly. And Sarah watched Enzo across the table, watched him and laugh. An actual laugh, the kind that came from somewhere old and thought, there he is. That's the boy in the margins of the cookbook. Later, drying dishes, Bianca got quiet. He's different, she said. You know that. Since you got here. I don't know what you did, but he answers the phone like a person. He came to dinner. He laughed twice. She set down a plate. My brother is a hard man, Sarah. He had to be. Our father made sure of it, but he wasn't born hard. There was a kid in there once who cried when the barn cat died. I keep hoping somebody'll remind him that kid existed. She looked over. You might be reminding him. Sarah didn't know what to say to that, so she said the true thing. He named the men tonight. At dinner, ask Sal about his mother's hip. He's never done that, has he? Bianca's eyes went bright. No, she said quietly. He hasn't. It should have been a good night. Quite, because at 11 Enzo's phone rang and Sarah was close enough to see his face change. He listened. He said almost nothing. When he hung up, the tired was gone and the cold was back, and he looked at her across the dark kitchen like he was deciding something. Tell me, she said. That's the deal. He almost didn't. She watched him almost not. Then he did. The Ayelos hit one of our places an hour ago. Nobody died, a breath. But here's the part I can't get past. They knew which place. They knew the schedule. They knew exactly when it'd be empty of customers and full of product. He set the phone down very carefully. Sarah, only 6 people knew that schedule, and 5 of them I'd trust with my life. The kitchen was very quiet. And the 6th, she said, that's the problem, Enzo said. And to 6th, Mole changed everything, and they both knew it. You can't plan around an enemy who's reading your mail. The move Enzo made, the Ayelos seemed to make first. A safe route got watched. A quiet meeting got loud. Twice that week, men of his walked into rooms that should have been empty and weren't. He stopped using the phones for anything that mattered. He stopped writing things down. He started talking to his men one at a time, in person, telling each of them a slightly different lie, watching to see which lie came back to bite him. It was slow. It was ugly, and it wasn't working. Hunting blind, Sarah said, the 4th night of it, watching him pour his second whiskey and not drink it. I'm aware. Can I see what you have? The intercepts. The messages your people pull off theirs. She held up a hand before he could say it. I know. Need to know. But you said you'd make me need to know. So, make me. I caught one thing nobody else in a room could catch. Maybe there's another. He looked at the whiskey he wasn't drinking. Then he got up and brought her a laptop. Most of it Spanish and English, he said. Some Italian. Tommy's people translate it. It's all logistics. Shipments, money, nothing. Let me hear it. Not read it, hear it. So he played her the audio. And for an hour, it was exactly what he said. Mundane, numbers and times and code words for things that were probably ugly but sounded like grocery lists. She was starting to feel foolish. And Sarah's hand shot out and stopped it. Play that again. He played it again. 2 men, low. The translation on the screen said Italian meeting Thursday, the usual place. Boring. Nothing. That's not Italian, she said. My guy says your guy hears Italian because it's close enough to Italian and he's not listening for the difference. She leaned in, every nerve awake. Play it a 3rd time. Listen to the vowels. He played it. She closed her eyes. There, she opened them. Trassery. He didn't say entrar. He said trassery. That's not Italian, Enzo. That's Sicilian. The old inland kind. Same as the men at the restaurant. She sat back, turning Sicilian into Italian for weeks and missing half of it. The Ayelos aren't hiding their plans in code. Putting them in a language they bet nobody around you speaks. Enzo stared at her. They bet right, he said slowly. For 20 years, they bet right. My grandmother used to say, a language is a house you can live in even after everyone who built it is gone. Sarah touched the laptop almost gentle. She made me keep Sicilian alive when I didn't want to. I thought it was sentiment. An old woman not wanting to let go. She looked up. Turns out she was handing me a key. It took her 3 days to go through everything they had. She did it the way she did everything, carefully, quietly, listening for what people didn't say as much as what they did. Nana, again, you noticed silences before you could talk, child. It scared me a little. And slowly a shape came up out of the noise, the same voice over and over. Inland Sicilian. always arranging meetings, always in the same 2 or 3 spots near the Newark docks. Not Don Calogero Aiello himself, too careful for that, but someone close. A planner, a right hand. And then, on the second day, something that made her stomach turn over. A meeting, voice, and a second man who spoke only English. American English. Flat, careful, lawyerly. The kind of voice that had never held a gun and never needed to. She played it for Enzo. "Who is that?" she said. "The American." Enzo listened. His face went still in a way she'd learned to dread. "Play it again." She played it. Voice said something about port authority filings and the legitimate side and keeping it clean on paper. "I know that voice," Enzo said quietly. "That's Walsh. He's not Aiello. He's not anybody's soldier." He set down the glass he'd forgotten he was holding. "He's a businessman. He handles the legal end of half the shipping on that stretch of coast. Inspections, the boring paper that makes a port run." A long breath. "He's been at my table. He's shaken my hand, and he's talking to the people trying to kill me about keeping it clean on paper. So it's not just an old family war," Sarah said. Pieces were turning, clicking. "The Aiellos want revenge, but somebody wants the docks. Legally, on paper, after the smoke clears. Somebody wearing a suit," Enzo said, "who'll never get blood on it. The Aiellos are the gun. Walsh is the hand." They sat with that. "You know what's strange?" Sarah said finally. "Thinking the dangerous men are the ones with the guns. The ones at the restaurant. The ones who hit your warehouse. But it's not them, is it? It's the quiet one in the nice office. It says he'll sign a form and take a whole port and never once feel like the bad guy. That's most of the real damage in the world," Enzo said. "Done by people who never think of themselves as doing damage. Who've got a clean story for it. A permit, a procedure, a reason." He looked at her. "My father had a reason for everything too, right up to the end." That night late, she found him on the back terrace in the cold. She brought 2 coffees, handed him one, didn't say anything for a while. The deer were out on the lawn, 3 of them, gray ghosts in the dark. "Thank you," he said, out of nowhere. "For the coffee, for the language, for hearing what nobody else could hear." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "For 3 days of work you didn't have to do. You could have sat in that beautiful house and let me handle it. It's not your war. My war when they put my name in a file." She sipped. "But that's not really why." "No," she looked out at the deer. "You want to know the truth. For 3 years I was invisible. People looked through me 100 times a night. And the worst part wasn't that they didn't see me. It was that I started to wonder if there was anything to see, if I was just air. Plates and a uniform and air." To him. "And then one night I heard something nobody else could hear. Found out the thing my grandmother gave me, the thing I thought was just an old woman's sentiment, was the one thing in that whole room of powerful men that could save a life." Her voice was steady. "I'm not doing this for you, Enzo. I'm doing it because for the first time in a long time I'm not air, and I'm not giving that back." Enzo looked at her for a long moment in the cold. "Father," he said, "would have called you useful. And you, I'd call you seen." He said it carefully, like a word in a language he was just learning. "And your whole life making sure other people get to feel like people. The men out front. Your brother. Even me." He shook his head slow. "So should do it for you. So, I see you, Serafina Conti, for whatever it's worth from a man like me." The deer lifted their heads, all 3 at once, and were gone into the trees. "It's worth something," she said quietly. "It's worth more than you think." They stood out there a while longer, not touching, 2 people from 2 worlds, learning the same thing from opposite ends. That the smallest thing you can give a person, a name, a coffee, the simple fact of being seen, is sometimes the thing that saves them. And somewhere in the city, a man in a nice suit signed a clean form and never once felt like the villain of anyone's story. It happened on a Tuesday. Sarah would think about that later. One day the men at the restaurant had picked, like the Aiellos had a fondness for it. Like Tuesday was their lucky day and nobody else's. A meeting in the city. A real one this time, with the heads of 2 other families. The careful old men who ran things in Boston and Philadelphia. To build something he kept calling an alliance, and Sarah kept hearing as a war. If the Aiellos and Fulch want the coast, he'd said the night before, they'll take it one family at a time. Alone we lose. Together, maybe not. He'd rubbed his eyes. But these men don't trust easy. They want guarantees, territory, favors. Everyone's got a handout, and you'll pay it. If it keeps us standing. Yeah, he took Tommy with him, Sal, and 2 cars. He left Marco and a couple of others on the house, and he made Sarah promise, hand on the table, that she'd stay inside with Matteo until he was back. She promised. She kept the promise. It didn't matter. The call came at 4 in the afternoon. In the kitchen with Matteo, teaching him to make Nana's sugo, the one with the long-cooked onions, when Marco's phone rang in the next room. She heard him answer. She heard him go quiet. And she heard him say, "How many?" in a voice that made her turn off the stove. He came into the kitchen with his face wrong. Marco never showed anything. Marco's face was a closed door, and now the door was open, and what was behind it was bad. There was an ambush, he said. On the way back from the meeting, they knew the route. Sarah's hands went cold around the wooden spoon. "Enzo, the boss is okay." "He's okay, Sarah." But Marco's eyes didn't match the word okay. "Tommy took 2 rounds. He's in surgery." "No, yet." A breath and Sal. The kitchen tilted. "What about Sal?" Marco looked at her, and he didn't say it because he didn't have to. "The thing about a closed door is that when it opens, you see everything at once." "No," Sarah said. "He went down covering the boss," Marco said. Quiet, like the volume could make it less true. "He didn't, it was fast." "He didn't suffer. He's 23. Her voice came from very far away. "His mother has a bad hip. He was going to drive her to the doctor next week. He told me to take the morning off and drive her himself, because she doesn't like the bus." Marco didn't say anything. There wasn't anything. Matteo, beside her, reached over and turned the burner the rest of the way off, the way you do one small useful thing because all the big things are out of reach. "Sarah," he said softly, "sit down. You're white." She sat. She didn't remember sitting. She thought about Sal in the doorway that first morning, staring at a cup of coffee like it was a trick. "You don't have to," he'd said. "I know," she'd said. "That's the point." She'd named him. She'd asked about his mother. Feel for a week like a person and not a tool. His world had used him like a tool anyway. Spent him. Put his body between the boss and a bullet because that's what the tool was for. Both things were true at once. She'd seen him, and it hadn't saved him. She put her face in her hands and she cried for a boy she'd known for 3 weeks. And Matteo put his arm around her, awkward and certain, and held on. Enzo came home at midnight. There was blood on his shirt in the kitchen doorway, and he looked 100 years old, and when he saw her face, he stopped. "You heard," Marco told me. She stood. "Tommy, out of surgery. Think he'll make it." He said it flat, like a man reading numbers off a page, because feeling them would have been too much. Sal didn't. "I know." He stepped in front of me. Enzo's voice cracked just slightly, just at the edge. "I didn't ask him to. There wasn't time to ask. He just did it. And he just stepped in front of me like it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Sarah said. And then she said the thing she had to say. Even though it was the wrong night, even though he was bleeding someone else's blood and she should have just held him and let it be. She said it because somebody had to. Mother Enzo. Enzo went still. He had a mother with a bad hip in Bensonhurst and a name and a whole life. Next week he was going to take a morning off to drive her to the doctor because she doesn't like the bus. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. He wasn't a tool. He wasn't useful. He was a person. And your world spent him like a quarter, and it won't even slow down. There'll be another Sal by the back door next week, and the week after, and your world will never once stop and say his name. I don't know that I think you've spent your whole life not knowing it, because knowing it would make this unbearable. She was crying again, and she didn't care. Your father taught you their tools, and the only way to run a thing like this is to half believe him, to round people off, not learn that Dom's daughter plays violin, and Sal's mother has a bad hip, because once you know it, you can't spend them anymore. Can you? The kitchen was dead silent. Enzo lowered himself into a chair. His shirt had gone brown at the edges. He looked at his hands. "His name was Salvatore Greco," he said quietly. "His mother is Concetta. She's 61. The hip is the left one." He looked up, and his eyes were wet, and Sarah had never once imagined this man's eyes could be wet. "I learned it tonight, in the car. After, I made Dom tell me everything about him, the whole drive back, because you were right, and I couldn't let him be just another one I didn't know." Sarah sat down across from him. "I'm going to that funeral," Enzo said. "Not in the back, not in a car across the street. I'm going to stand next to his mother, and I'm going to tell her that her son saved my life, and that I knew his name, and that he wasn't nothing to me." His jaw worked. "It's not enough. It's nowhere near enough, but it's the start of something. Maybe the start of getting out of a business where boys like that get spent." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, the one with the dried blood on the cuff. "That's the first thing you've said," she told him, "that your father couldn't have said." He held on like the table was the only thing keeping him up, and maybe that night it was. Sal's funeral was on a gray Saturday, and Enzo did exactly what he said. He stood at the front. He held Concetta Greco's hand. Sarah watched from a few rows back and saw the old woman look up at this dangerous man and ask the only question that mattered, was my boy brave? And saw Enzo answer her low and steady for a long time. Whatever he said, Conchetta nodded and cried and held his hand tighter instead of letting go. On the drive home, Enzo didn't speak for 20 minutes. He said, "We find the mole. Now, whatever it takes. Because Sal is dead because someone told them the route, and I am done. I am done burying people because there's a leak I won't look at directly." "You know who it has to be," Sarah said gently. "It has to be one of the 5. His voice was iron. "The 5 I'd trust with my life. That's the part I can't. These are men I came up with. Men I'd take a bullet for. One of them is taking bullets from you," Sarah said. "Or worse, pointing them." And it 3 days later. The way she found everything. Listening. Intercepts. All of them. With a new question in her head. Not what are they planning. That she had. New questions was who's telling them. And she caught it in a single word. The inland Sicilian voice. The Aiello planner was on a call, arranging a handoff. And he said a name. Quick, careless. The way you say a name when you're comfortable. When the person you're talking about is yours. He said Tommaso. Tommy. Sarah sat very still in the dark office. It didn't make sense. Tommy had taken 2 rounds in that ambush. Tommy was in a hospital bed right now with tubes in his arm. You don't get shot in an ambush you set up. Unless. She played it again. And again. And then she went back through everything, listening now for the gaps, the silences, the things that didn't fit, and they were there. Once she knew to look. Me, always the one to suggest the route. In place, the lie didn't come back because Enzo trusted him too much to test him. Tommy, who took 2 rounds in the arm and the shoulder bad, real but not where a man dies. The kind of wound you might let happen. The kind of wound that buys you above suspicion forever. She didn't want it to be true. She'd watched Tommy move like water in that restaurant. She'd watched him carry their bags up the steps. She'd watched Enzo look at him like a brother. But the truth doesn't care what you want. She told Enzo in the kitchen, because that was where they told each other things now. He didn't believe her. Of course he didn't. Tommy got shot, Sarah. In the arm. In the shoulder. And who knew exactly where everyone was going to be. She kept her voice steady because one of them had to. And is a cheap price for never being suspected. You said it yourself, you'd trust him with your life. So you never tested him. You tested everyone but him. That's not a mistake on your end. That's the thing he counted on. And so turned away, put both hands on the counter. His head dropped. "Why?" he said. One word he'd used with her that first night, except now it was breaking. Why would he? "I'd give him anything." "He knows that?" he asked. That's what I had to find out," Sarah said. "Because it didn't make sense to me either. A man doesn't sell his brother for nothing." Went out on the counter. "So I followed the money. There isn't any. He's not being paid." And Tommy touches, and there's no money. Then why? Because they have his family. Enzo went still, and his sister are still in Sicily, Sarah said quietly, near Palermo. Knew that. Months ago, the Aiellos took the house next to theirs, and the one across the road. And Tommy Enzo. They didn't have to. They just moved in next to his mother. No, they were there. Every day. Every week. We're right here. Such a nice family. Be a shame. She swallowed. He's not betraying you for money. He loves are within reach of people who'd hurt them. And he's 3,000 miles away, and he can't protect them. So he protects them the only way he can. By feeding the wolves a little blood at a time and praying it's enough. The kitchen was very quiet. "That doesn't make it right," Enzo said. His voice was raw. "Sal is dead." "No, it doesn't make it right." Sarah came around the counter to stand in front of him. And Tommy carries that now, forever, and nothing makes that right. "I'm not telling you to forgive him. I'm telling you why, because you asked, and because the why matters." She held his eyes. "He didn't stop loving you. He loves his mother more. That's not evil, Enzo. One thing there is love that gets twisted into something terrible, because someone with power put a person in an impossible place and squeezed. What do I do with that?" Enzo said. "Me, a man got my Sal killed, and then you tell me he did it out of love, and I'm supposed to." He stopped. "What do I do with that?" "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "I don't have the answer. I know that the men who put him in that place, the Aiellos, and whoever's holding the leash above them, they're the ones who reached across an ocean and turned love into a weapon." Tommy pulled the trigger and told him it was the only way to keep his mother breathing. She touched his arm. "Be angry at the man, but save the real anger for the ones who built the trap." Enzo was silent a long time. More, Sarah said, soft, "And it's worse." "How is it worse?" "Because the man squeezing Tommy isn't an Aiello." She took a breath. "I went back through everything one more time. The order to use Tommy's family, it didn't come from Don Calogero. It came through Walsh, the man in the suit, the paperwork man." She watched it land. "The Aiellos think they're running this. They're not. Walsh found the pressure point Tommy's mother and handed it to them like a gift, and steering the whole war from behind a desk. Territory. Walsh just wants the port, clean and legal, after everyone with a gun has killed each other off. Enzo straightened slowly. Something hardened in him, not the cold from before, the brittle cold his father gave him, but something else. Something with a spine. The man who got Sal killed, he said, never touched a gun. Never gave an order anyone could trace. Just found a frightened son 3,000 miles from his mother. And a feud old enough to reopen and arrange things. On paper, clean. And he'll walk out of all of this, Enzo said, richer and respectable, and certain he never did anything wrong, unless someone stops him, Sarah said. And here's the hard part. You can't stop a paper man with a gun. Shoot Walsh, you've murdered a respected businessman and you go away forever, and the port still gets eaten by whoever takes his place. The only thing that stops a man like Walsh is the one weapon he thinks he's too clean to fear. She held his eyes. Proof. The kind that holds up, and that puts the suit, not just the soldiers, in front of a judge. Enzo looked at her for a long moment. And the only way to get proof a man like that doesn't already control, he said slowly, is to get someone inside. Someone the Ayelos and Walsh have never seen. Someone they'd never in 1,000 years suspect. Sarah didn't answer her. She didn't have to. He saw it on her face and his own went pale. No, he said. Absolutely not. Sarah, Tommy's family is still next to those people in Sicily, she said quietly. Sal's mother just buried her son. This doesn't end because we know who's doing it. It ends when we can prove it. She took a breath. We'll talk about it tomorrow. You can hear it. The answer's no. Tomorrow, she said gently. When you can hear it. And she went to check on her brother and left him standing in the kitchen with the printout and the dried blood long since washed from his cuffs, and the first real understanding settling over him like snow that the most dangerous men don't raise their voices, and the most human crimes are the ones done out of love, and that the trap he'd been caught in his whole life was never the one with the bomb at the docks. It was the one his father built the day he taught a boy that people were tools. They argued about it for 2 days. Enzo said no in every way a man can say no. He said it angry. He said it quiet. He said it with his hands flat on the table and his voice gone to gravel. He said, I just buried Sal. I'm not burying you two. And Sarah let him. She let him empty the whole tank. Then she said the thing that ended it. I'm not a soldier, Enzo. I can't shoot. I can't fight. If you send one of your men in there, the Ayelos make him in 30 seconds because your men look like your men. But me. She spread her hands. I'm a waitress who speaks 2 kinds of Spanish and the old Sicilian nobody bothers to learn. I'm exactly the person the world looks straight through. Invisible my whole life. For once, let me use it for something. He didn't answer for a long time. That's the part I hate, he finally said. You're right. Underestimated is the only real weapon you've got. And it works because people like Walsh never imagined the help could be dangerous. He looked at her. I've spent my whole life on the other side of that. Being the man people fear. I never once thought about how much power there is in being the person nobody sees. Now you know how the rest of us live, Sarah said. There were rules. He made her swear to all of them. A wire in a necklace. A team 3 minutes out. A word Palermo that meant pull her out now, no questions. She'd pose as a freelance translator hired through a real agency for a single meeting at a warehouse near the Newark docks where Walsh's people and the Ayelos were finalizing the thing they'd been killing each other toward. You walk in, Enzo said. You translate. You let them say what they say. And the second anything feels wrong, you say the word, and I burn that building down to get you out. Understood. Understood. Mean it, Sarah. He took her face in his hands, gentle, the way he'd never once handled anything in his life. No information is worth you. None. If it comes down to the proof, or you walking out that door, you walk out that door. Every time. No, say it back. I walk out the door. Every time. She covered his hands with hers. I'm coming home, Enzo. I have a brother who saves me the comics page. I'm coming home. The warehouse looked like nothing. That was the thing about real danger, Sarah was learning. It never looked like the movies. It looked like a tired building with a faded sign for a plumbing company that had gone under years ago. Cracked lot, rusted siding. The kind of place you'd drive past 1,000 times. She walked in with a portfolio held to her chest and her grandmother's voice in her ear. Be small, child. Small isn't weak. Small is the mouse that walks under the cat. There were 5 men inside. From the way she'd clocked tables for 3 years. 2 by the Dormuscle Aiello, the inland Sicilian kind. 1 older man at the head of the table, grey and still. The planner whose voice she'd memorized off a dozen recordings. And 2 she didn't know, Americans, soft-handed, careful suits. One of them was Walsh. She knew him the second he spoke. That flat, lawyerly voice. The voice that had ordered Sal's death without ever saying a word that could be traced. "You're the translator," he said. Not a question. "Yes, sir. You speak Sicilian and English. And Italian. And Spanish if you need it." She kept her eyes down, her voice flat, boring. "The most forgettable woman in the world. I translate exactly what's said. Nothing added. Nothing left out. Good." He gestured to a chair between the two groups. "Understand this is a delicate conversation. And you've shaded one word. The men by the door will have feelings about it. Are we clear?" Completely clear. And for 40 minutes she did her job. She translated the old Sicilian planner's words into English for Walsh. Translated Walsh's English back into Sicilian for the planner. And the whole time, the necklace at her throat drank in every word the territory split, the timeline, the money, and most of all, Walsh, in his clean, careful voice, exactly how he'd arranged a war from behind a desk and stayed clean while other men bled. "The Castellano problem resolves itself," Walsh said at one point, and she translated it evenly. Inside she thought of Sal's mother holding Enzo's hand. Was my boy brave? She held her face still. 3 years of being invisible. Turned out invisible was armor. But there was a moment. The younger Aiello Nino, the planner's nephew, a man not much older than Matteo, was sent to bring coffee. And when he set the cup down by Sarah, their eyes met for half a second. And she saw it. She always saw, because seeing it was the one talent she'd never been able to turn off. He was scared. Underneath the hard face and the borrowed swagger, this boy was scared out of his mind. Men who'd spend him like a quarter the second it was useful. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. But she looked at him, really looked, the way nobody in that room had looked at her in her whole serving life, and for just a second, she let him see that she saw him. That somebody in that cold room knew he was a person. It cost her nothing. She had no idea yet that it would save everything. The trap, when it sprang, was beautiful and terrible, and not at all what anyone planned. Sarah's job was only ever to record, and confess, and walk out the door. But the thing about putting greedy, frightened, violent men in one room is that they don't need much help destroying each other. The money came up. Walsh laid out the split, the port revenue, who got what after the Castellanos were gone. And the old Sicilian planner's face changed slow like weather coming in. Not the numbers the Aiellos had been promised. Sarah translated it exactly. She didn't have to shade a word. The truth was sharp enough on its own. "Not our agreement," the planner said in Sicilian, very soft. Sarah translated. "He says that's not the deal." Walsh smiled the smile of a man who'd never once been on the wrong end of anything. "The deal evolved. Muscle. Muscle is cheap. The structure, the permits, the legal architecture, that's mine. You'll take what I offer, and you'll be glad of it." She translated that too. Every word. And she watched it land on a proud old man from an island where the wrong word in the wrong tone is the thing you answer for. The planner stood, in Sicilian rising, "that you can stand on our blood and our dead and our families held hostage, and then count out coins to us like we are your servants." Sarah opened her mouth to translate, and Walsh, impatient, certain a man who'd never feared anyone in his life, made his one mistake. "I don't need the dialect," he snapped at her. I caught the tone. "Tell this old man," he never finished. Because the old man had understood "I don't need the dialect." Understood that Walsh had been following more than he let on. And in that second, a proud man decided he'd been disrespected one time past bearing. A gun came out. Then everything came out at once. Sarah was already moving under the table, the word Palermo, leaving her lips into the necklace, low and clear. The room went to noise and muzzle flash and shouting in 3 languages. She pressed herself to the cold concrete and made herself small, small as the mouse under the cat. And she thought, absurdly, Matteo turning off the burner. One small useful thing. She covered her head. The doors came in, not Enzo's men, or not only. Federal agents, 'cause Enzo, it turned out, had made a call 3 days ago to a contact who owed him, and handed over everything, the intercepts, the recordings, the whole clean architecture of Walsh's clean crimes, on one condition, that when it ended in a courtroom and not a grave. No more spending people, he told Sarah, not even the guilty ones. We do this the right way, or I'm just my father with better manners. Hands found her under the table. Gentle. Dom's voice. I got you. Come on, Palermo, she said. Palermo, I'm getting you out. And she was up and moving through the chaos, past men on their knees with their hands behind their heads, past the old planner face down on the concrete, past Walsh, the paper man being read his rights by an agent who did not care how nice his suit was. She made it to the door. There, against the wall, cuffed already, was Nino, the scared boy, the one she'd seen. Their eyes met again. To ask you to talk, Sarah said to him, quiet in Sicilian as Dom pulled her past, about Walsh. About all of it. You don't owe these men your silence. They were going to spend you too. She held his eyes one last second. You're allowed to choose different. You're a person. You always were. She didn't know if it would land. It landed. Nino Aiello testified. Nobody in that room had ever once treated like a person turned out to be the one witness who could tie the suit to the soldiers, and he did it. In half second in a cold warehouse, a waitress had looked at him like he mattered. That's the thing nobody in his whole life had told him. Sarah had. For free, because it cost nothing. Outside, 2 blocks away, Enzo was already out of the car before it stopped. Anything for a long time. Just held on, like the world might take her back if he let go. You said the word, he finally managed. You said it. I heard you say it. I said it. She was shaking now, the adrenaline draining out, leaving her hollow. I walked out the door. Like I promised. You did. He pulled back, checked her face, her arms, the way he had to with his own eyes. You're okay. In federal custody. So's the planner. So's everyone in that building. His shoes. It's over, Sarah. The right way. Nobody got spent. It ends in a courtroom. And Tommy. Enzo's face went still. I told the agents the truth. All of it. The hostage. His mother. The impossible place they put him. A pause. He'll answer for Sal. He has to. He was a man squeezed by people who reached across an ocean. And that there's a difference between a monster and a frightened son. The agents are talking to the Italians. His family out from under the Aiellos. He looked at her. It's not forgiveness. And I'm done with a world that doesn't tell it. Sarah leaned into him. Exhausted. And let the cold city hold them both up. 3 months can be a lifetime or no time at all. The trials would grind on for years, these things always did. But the shape of it was set the day Nino Aiello took the stand. Walsh, the clean man, the paper man, learned that the one weapon he'd always thought himself too respectable to fear was simply the truth, spoken out loud, by people he'd never bothered to see. Tommy answered for what he did, but his mother and his sister came home from Sicily, safe, and the day they landed. Enzo paid for the flight and never mentioned it again. And Enzo did the hardest thing of all, the thing his father could never have imagined. He started getting out. Not in a night. You don't unbuild a thing like that in a night. Imports, the real business. The part that didn't need a gun that he kept, and grew, and put his name on in the daylight. The rest he let go piece by piece, and where he couldn't let it go clean, he handed it to the agents who'd kept their word. My father built an empire on fear, he told Sarah one evening, on the terrace where the deer used to come. And he died alone in it. I'd rather build something small and real and be able to look the people in it in the eye. He smiled, tired but lighter than she'd ever seen him. You taught me that. You and a kid named Salvatore Greco, whose name I'll say for the rest of my life. Sarah didn't take a job from him, and he understood why, which mattered even more. Instead, with a loan she negotiated herself at the real rate, no favors she'd checked, she opened a place in Queens. Not far from where Nana had waited tables on a bad knee. A kitchen and a storefront, Rosalia's. Her grandmother's name in the window where everyone could see it. She cooked the sugo with the long-cooked onions, imported oil and wine through Enzo's legitimate company, at a fair markup clean. And she hired the people the world looked through. Cooks nobody'd promote. The dishwasher with the accent people made fun of. A young woman fresh off a plane, who spoke 4 languages and was being treated like she spoke none. Sarah learned their names the first day. She asked about their mothers. Why do you do that? The dishwasher asked her once, the same way Sal once had. Ask about my family. Remember my name. The other places I was just the dishwasher. Because you're not just the dishwasher, Sarah said. Nobody is just anything. My grandmother used to say you can tell everything about a person by how they treat the people who can't do a thing for them. She handed him a coffee the way she always would, for the rest of her life. I spent a long time being invisible. I know exactly what it costs. So I decided I'd never make anybody else pay it. That's the whole secret. It's not complicated. It's just see people. It's free. And it changes everything. Matteo worked the register on weekends and charmed every customer who walked in. He saved the comics page for her, still. On a Thursday evening, with the place closed and the chairs up, Enzo came by. No suit. Just a man who got cold like everyone else, carrying takeout coffee because the espresso machine was already cleaned for the night. They sat in the quiet room with her grandmother's name glowing in the window. You ever think about how it started, he said. One sentence. In a language everyone else had given up on, all the time. She wrapped her hands around the cup. Nana made me keep it alive when I thought it was just an old woman not letting go of the past. Turns out she was handing me a key, to a door I couldn't even see yet, to this, to everything. She looked around the small bright room. I used to think the powerful people were the ones who mattered, the ones at the head of the table. I think the whole world runs on the people nobody looks at, the ones carrying the plates. We see everything. We hear everything. We just spent so long being told we're air that we forgot we were ever anything else. Enzo reached over and took her hand. not to lead her anywhere, just to hold it, an equal's hand. For what it's worth from a man like me, he said, I see you, Serafina Conti. I know you do. She squeezed back. That's the part that took the longest to learn, not how to make other people feel seen. She smiled, and outside the window, the lights of Queens came on, one by one, over a neighborhood full of invisible people who were never, not one of them, actually invisible at all. But how to let myself be. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. No intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
And so Serafina Conti's story is not only a mafia romance, not only a story of danger, betrayal, and survival. It is a reminder that the people the world overlooks are often the ones who see the most, hear the most, and carry the quietest kind of strength. Sarah began as a waitress, a woman trained by life to be invisible, to lower her eyes, to serve, to endure. But the very thing others dismissed became her greatest power. Her courage was not loud. It did not come from weapons, money, or status. It came from dignity, from memory, from the values her grandmother planted in her heart. Never turn away from someone in danger. Never treat people as tools. And never forget that every human being has a name, a family, a story, and a soul. Through Sarah, Enzo learns that fear may build an empire, but it cannot build a life worth living. Power without humanity only leaves a man alone, surrounded by people who obey him, but do not truly love him. Sal S. death, Tommy S. betrayal, and Walsh S. cold ambition all reveal the same painful truth. When people are treated as objects, the world becomes cruel enough to spend them without hesitation. But when one person chooses to truly see another, everything can begin to change. The meaning of this story is simple, but powerful. Nobody is just anything. Nobody is just a waitress, just a guard, just a dishwasher, just a soldier, just a forgotten person in the background. Every life matters. Every name matters. Kindness may seem small, but sometimes a name remembered, a cup of coffee offered, or one honest sentence spoken at the right moment can save a life, expose the truth, and change the future. Serafina's journey teaches us that real strength is not in making others fear you, but in making others feel seen. And in a world that so often looks through people, choosing to see them may be the bravest act of all.